I would say I've always been very confused with my gender identity.
How many genders are there?
The many.
Excuse me, it's ma'am.
We're humans just like you. We're people just like you. We have kids, we have parents, we have brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins. We're just trying to live.
And breaking news, we have just confirmed that a registered child sex offender has been reading to children at a Houston public library as part of its Drag Queen Story Hour.
Bringing drag performers together with little kids is kind of a perfect relationship.
Happy Pride Month. Happy Pride Year. Happy Pride Life.
Hi, I'm Major Rachel Jones.
Basically, wherever we can get kids and drag together, we read. And we spread literacy and love and acceptance. And we have over 50 chapters in the country.
Goodness, what has brought me the most joy?
How did Drag Queen Story Hour come about?
It was first founded in 2015 by a group of trans Latin drag queens.
And it was founded by Michelle T., author and activist Michelle T., and it was born in the Castro Library. And from then, we've been going strong.
Transgenderism. It's the most hotly debated and controversial topic in modern political discourse. Prior to the modern day, the issues relating to homosexuality, lesbianism, and gender identity, to use the modern phrasing, were relegated to the fringes of society, or reserved for the upper classes, who, from time to time, would theorize about such things with their elite friends, or even, in rarer cases, dabble in such things themselves. Since the mid to late 2010s, however, transgenderism has been one of the biggest hot-button issues in American politics. So what's going on? Why did the idea experience such a meteoric rise?
Before 2015, most people thought of trannies as transvestites, or drag queens. These people were weirdos and assumed to be pedophiles or, at the very least, sexual deviants. Drag shows, pride marches, and other private events were considered to be activities between consenting adults, so there wasn't a big movement to legislate against them. Most Americans were willing to tolerate it, so long as it didn't intrude on their personal lives or become normalized. Live and let live, many of them said, although some on the national stage were sounding the alarm much sooner and much louder than others.
Remember that 2015 was the year that gay marriage was legalized nationwide when the Supreme Court, in the case of Obergefell v. Hodges, interpreted the 14th Amendment to include protections for same-sex marriage, and we had our first gay-affirming president in history, and some might say our first gay president. At the time, the approval rating for gay marriage was polling at around 50%. My, how the times were changing.
Then came Bruce Jenner's infamous interview with Diane Sawyer in 2015. I actually saw this live on ABC when it happened, by chance. I watched it with my ultra-progressive girlfriend at the time, during my long libertarian phase. In it, Bruce said that he secretly liked to wear dresses, and after a long time in the closet, he was a woman and his name was Caitlin. Diane Sawyer, being about 70 at the time, asked a lot of confused questions, but Bruce kept insisting that he was in all actuality a woman. I sat there, confused, while my girlfriend excitedly watched. I asked, "Wait, what does that mean?" Which received an impatient reply from my girlfriend, "Caitlyn Jenner is a woman." As if that was such an easy concept to grasp, I kept my mouth shut because my libertarian religion forbade me to pry into other people's business. If Bruce wanted to be Caitlyn now, what right had I to say anything? The rise of social media really helped bring transgenderism, as well as all the other LGBTQ issues, to the forefront. It gave a microphone to everyone, regardless of how ill-informed, agenda-driven, or mentally unstable they were. It also created echo chambers, where like-minded individuals across the globe could enable each other's delusions.
This is where we started to see major corporations market their products to the LGBT community, who were harnessing social media to become some of the loudest and most disruptive voices on the internet. Realizing that this demographic could make or break a brand, companies began changing their profile pictures to incorporate the rainbow flag. They changed their language on social media platforms to be more inclusive. They issued statements and crafted advertisements to specifically cater to this demographic. And most importantly, they invested heavily in marketing during the month of June, which helped normalize Pride Month.
Pride Month is a 30-day celebration devised by members of the LGBTQ+ community to commemorate the Stonewall riots of 1969, a series of violent protests in New York City which erupted in response to a police raid of a mafia-owned gay bar. In the following years, gay pride parades popped up in major cities across the US, but the holiday remained niche until the social media age. Now it's mainstream, and since the LGBTQ movement has such a large presence online, companies are protecting their image by making acceptance of Pride Month and LGBTQ+ issues mandatory. Those who disagree are often forced to apologize or they're outright fired, in order for the company at large to avoid the effects of cancel culture.
As cultural Marxism has infected more and more of our major Western institutions, different social issues have had their time on the main stage. Race relations, police brutality, wealth disparities, environmental justice, gay rights, these are some examples. But for the last few years, transgenderism has been the latest and greatest issue which liberal activists have tried to promote. The sheer absurdity of such claims, that some biological males could and should be considered female, or vice versa, and that gender itself is a, quote, social construct, was too much for some people to take.
This prompted Matt Walsh and his team at the Daily Wire to ask a simple question. What is a woman? What is a Woman is a documentary that was released in June of 2022. At the time of recording, it has received over 150 million views, despite being exclusively available to Daily Wire paid subscribers, and has over 80% audience and expert scores on Rotten Tomatoes, somehow. In this groundbreaking film, Matt Walsh interviews a wide array of activists and professionals, including politicians, gender studies professors, transgender opponents to minor transitioning, Jordan B. Peterson, and a gender reassignment surgeon. A notable part of the film is Walsh's trip to a primitive tribe in Kenya, where he asked them the titular, "What is a woman?"
Based on what I'm saying, would you ever want to move to America?
They say no, never.
Come on, man.
Walsh also later exposed a children's gender clinic and forced them to shut it down due to public outrage. This one man has single-handedly changed the conversation on transgenderism in America.
Now let's talk about Dylan Mulvaney. If you have lived under a rock for the past few years, congratulations. But Dylan Mulvaney is a gay man pretending to be a transgender woman. He tried to make it big as an influencer for a while, but when being gay didn't work out, he used the power of TikTok to become a woman impersonator, which finally allowed him to become the internet sensation he always wanted to be. He's had some surgery to make the illusion a little bit more convincing, but we'll let you be the judge of that. In early 2023, Dylan Mulvaney announced that he had just signed a deal to be a spokesman for Bud Light. Yes, that Bud Light that frat bros and good old Southern boys drink.
Well, this news was too much for the conservative movement. For the first time in a long time, conservatives actually formed an effective boycott against Bud Light. Seeing that horrendously demonic face smiling at you while you drink a cold one with the boys was simply too much. Bud Light sales dropped by double-digit percentages. And Anheuser-Busch put out a pathetic press release where they placed the blame for the sponsorship on an ad agency, but the sales decline showed no signs of abating. As for me, Budweiser used to be my favorite cheap beer, but I will never buy it again. Conservatives and other fed-up Americans took some inspiration from this concerted effort and moved their targets elsewhere. Literally. Target recently showcased tuck-friendly swimwear and clothing for trans kids, presumably inspired by Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs. Though they removed the displays after an uproar, Target lost $12.4 billion in market value by the end of May.
The Call of Duty game franchise is yet another brand to face backlash from fans over the trans debate. What do transgender people have to do with violent shooting games? In theory, nothing at all. But gay pride made its way into the world of Modern Warfare 2 Remastered when popular COD player Nick Kolcheff, known online as Nick Mercs, responded to videos of protesters clashing with Pride Month activists outside of a Los Angeles school board meeting. Nick Mercs tweeted, "They should leave little children alone. That's the real issue." The next day, Call of Duty effectively ended their partnership with Nick Mercs, tweeting out,
"Due to recent events, we have removed the Nick Mercs Operator Bundle from Modern Warfare 2 and Warzone Store. We are focused on celebrating Pride with our employees and our community."
Many have called for a boycott of Call of Duty, a sentiment which has been echoed by a few other well-known streamers, namely Dr. Disrespect and Tim Beitar.
These kinds of demonstrations will make a difference if this trend continues. These corporations aren't actually woke at heart. They don't believe in anything besides one core dogma: profit. If the LGBTQ+ movement becomes unprofitable, these corporations will strangle it, put it in a bag, and throw it off a bridge into the river. They would support fascism if they projected profit from it. I guarantee it. So the real question isn't if these boycotts will change the status quo, but if conservatives will continue to sacrifice convenience to make an impact on our culture and economy.
Was there any precedent for transgenderism in the ancient world? Let's take a look at how some ancient civilizations perceived trans people, or people who did not conform to the look or roles of their biological sex.
In ancient China, war, disaster, and famine were often blamed on these, quote, abnormal humans, unquote, which they called Renyeo, or human goblins. Famous cross-dressers such as Lao Qing of the 5th century were ordered to return home and stop dressing as men. Meanwhile, the stumpy and mannish white-capped crow of the Song dynasty led men into battle, allegedly killed all her husbands, and was ultimately blamed for the invasion of China by the Khitan people. And during the Qing dynasty, which began in 1644, it was considered a capital offense for a man to dress as a woman.
In ancient Greece, the only form of cross-dressing which the Greeks would have allowed wasn't even really cross-dressing at all. Since women were prohibited from acting on stage, the female characters in plays were portrayed by men. This was not done for mere sexual gratification, but for the purpose of art and storytelling. For a more detailed debunking of the gay Greek trope, check out Leather Apron Club's video on the subject. The ancient Greeks were obsessed with manliness and viewed male femininity as weak, sinful, and worthy of contempt. Being trans, in the modern sense, would have cost a person their freedom, their citizenship, or even their life in ancient Greece.
In the Islamic world, and I think you can see where this is going, distinctions between men and women are obvious and strictly enforced to this day. Women are made to wear the burqa or hijab and are discouraged from operating motor vehicles or leaving the house unescorted, whereas men enjoy greater freedoms of movement and dress. In many countries, Sharia law governs the behavior of Muslim people and penalizes both men and women for acting in ways contrary to their station. The Quran makes things quite clear, quote, "O mankind, we created you from a male and a female," unquote. It also says, quote, "And from the two of them he spread forth multitudes of men and women," unquote. And to make things even clearer, quote, "And the male is not like the female," unquote. Iran and Afghanistan are often considered some of the most dangerous places for members of the LGBTQ community in the modern day. But keep in mind that these practices and social norms go back centuries, and in fact are based strongly on the religion itself.
In Native American cultures, there is some evidence to suggest that some nations accepted masculine women and feminine men as two-spirit people, and even elevated them to a higher status in their communities. Could this be a partial explanation for why Native American people lacked cultural or technological innovation? Perhaps. But it is unclear how widespread this belief was, and given the fact that Native American tribes were not a united, unicultural people, but rather a diverse collection of competing and conflicting groups, it's likely that this was not the norm. What is clear, however, is that hunting and warfare, traditionally masculine activities, were conducted exclusively by men. It's also worth noting that the Aztecs were very pro-equality when it came to public execution and sacrifice. To appease their gods, the Aztecs would often kill thousands of men, women, and children in ritual sacrifices. But if we're being honest, this type of barbarism doesn't exactly make a great argument for gender equality.
These are just a few examples of how different societies dealt with transgenderism and/or the bending of gender roles in the past. Overall, homosexuality, lesbianism, sexual promiscuity, and cross-dressing have all been heavily restricted and punished in the general population of nearly all peoples at nearly every point in history.
Now that we've covered some history on transgenderism, let's talk about the actual ideology as it exists today. Gender dysphoria, or a difference between one's biological sex and the perceived gender identity, has arguably been around for a long time in extremely rare cases. But in the past, this usually came through in cross-dressing, effeminacy, and homosexuality. These unique men didn't actually say that they were women, just that they were flamboyant. And the women weren't men, they were just tomboyish or butch. Gender dysphoria is simply the pitiable state of feeling like you were born in the wrong body, and can be classified as a mental illness since the person's perception of reality does not match reality. Transgender ideology, on the other hand, is the militant belief that gender is whatever the person says it is, completely separate from biological sex. Many in this camp also deny the reality of biological sex by pointing to the extremely rare cases of intersex people and others with genetic abnormalities. Also, gender is not confined to male and female in their worldview, but is literally an infinite array of identities that are discoverable by individuals. That being said, let's discuss some of the terms that these radicals use.
Cis, or cisgendered, means identifying as the gender you were assigned at birth. Notice how they use words like identify and assigned, as if babies are not born exclusively with male or female sex organs, but are simply given a gender, as if by random selection or the will of the parents.
Non-binary means choosing to identify as neither male nor female. This implies that male and female are the only two genders, similar to the term bisexual, which was in common usage until the people using these words realized that the bi prefix implied that there were only two genders.
Oh man! Oh God! Oh man!
X is the social construct, is a phrase which is used to subvert reality and argue that X, usually anything that is traditional or commonly accepted like gender roles, gender itself, heterosexuality, etc., is arbitrarily made up by society and isn't actually real. But if gender, for example, is a social construct, pray tell, why do men feel the need to dress and act like female stereotypes in order to affirm their gender, and vice versa? If gender is a social construct, then a girly girl can still act girly and be a man, right?
Gender affirmation, or gender affirming, is any action which makes it more clear that a person is trying to look or feel like or become a particular gender. This comes back to the same problem. If gender is whatever you want it to be, then why do you feel like you have to adhere to binary gender expressions in order to affirm your new gender?
Dead naming is referring to the name previously used by a trans person before they transitioned and changed their name. For example, Bruce Jenner became Caitlyn and Ellen Page became Elliot, so Bruce and Ellen are the dead names. Again, why change your name and looks if gender is the social construct? In the case of Ellen Page, wouldn't it be more sensible for her to protest the evil, heteronormative, cis, white, patriarchal, Christian, colonialist social construct of gender by remaining womanly, keeping her female name, and demanding people call her a man?
Gender dysphoria is the state of believing you're a different gender than you really are.
Transitioning is the act of changing one's looks, name, preferred pronouns, legal status, and/or anatomy in order to fit one's preferred gender identity. For a broader list of vocabulary, if you care, check out the Yale Medicine article linked in the description or consult any mainstream media outlet of your choosing.
What is the essence of transgenderism anyway? The tranny says that they feel like the other sex or another gender entirely. But what does that mean? What does it mean to feel like a woman? Is it as simple as liking fashion and makeup? Is it as simple as singing karaoke to a Shania Twain song? If so, the man in question is equating womanhood with female stereotypes. But certainly there are men who are fashion designers and women who are engineers. While we may argue about whether or not this should be celebrated, we cannot argue that they are less male or female because of this, because their maleness or femaleness is inherent to their biological sex. That's why Dylan Mulvaney embodies female stereotypes to identify as a girl, yet it comes across as offensive and, quite honestly, disgusting. Now, one could argue that trans people have irregular amounts of testosterone or estrogen. If that's the case, the cure is simple. Give them testosterone or estrogen supplements to align them more with their actual sex.
Deep down, though, transgender ideology is a resurrection of Gnosticism. Gnosticism is the ancient belief that the material world is bad and the spiritual world is good. There is a stark separation between the body and the soul, whereas in reality, the soul and body are combined to form one individual. A body without a soul is a corpse, and a soul without a body is a ghost. The transgender person is essentially saying that he was born in the wrong body, that his soul is another gender which does not correspond to his body. It's like a guy I knew in college who was utterly convinced that he was reincarnated from an Asian person because he loved Japanese things. True story. But the tranny almost never believes in reincarnation or structured religion. So what explanation do they have for this disparity? There is not a good one. Either God put their soul in the wrong body, making him either evil or incompetent. They need to disregard their body and prioritize their soul, or their hormones are out of whack. All three choices leave the person hating his or her body. Thus, it is no wonder that many transgender people nowadays are young women who are psychologically prone to hate their developing bodies. Or take the case of young men who aren't quite as manly as the chads at school, thus imagining that maybe they are actually women.
Some of you may object to what we've said so far, so let's tackle a few common counter-arguments from the trans activists.
Objection 1. What about intersex people? Well, to this I would say that the exception proves the rule. Those who are born with ambiguous genitalia are around 0.02% of the world population. If you see figures like 1.7% that I saw in my research, that includes people who have conditions like Turner's or Klinefelter syndromes, which means they are genetic defects, but there is no question what sex they are from their genitalia, so it is highly misleading. Intersex people almost always know their sex by the time they reach adulthood, thus reinforcing the gender binary. Additionally, this argument is a little disingenuous because the vast majority of transgender people are not intersex. They have clear genetic proof of their gender, which is synonymous with sex.
Objection 2. Gender is a social construct. One could argue that gender roles could be influenced by social norms, although boys tend to like violence and girls tend to like cooperation in their play from a very young age. This argument is more of a chicken or egg situation. Are social norms shaped by innate gender differences, or are gender differences shaped by social norms? Regardless, gender roles and gender itself are very different. Gender and sex are interchangeable, and sex is objective. But what a man or woman is supposed to do is more subjective and differs slightly from group to group and from time to time.
Objection 3. If you don't let transgender people transition, they will kill themselves. This is perhaps the most pernicious argument for allowing transgenders to do what they want without constraint or disapproval. It is akin to a threat and reminds me of a suicide bomber, if we're being honest. If you don't do what I want, I will kill myself and cause others to have a lifetime of grief. How emotionally manipulative this is, especially to parents with gender-confused kids. It is true that trannies are far more likely to try to kill themselves than the general population. But is it the fault of the critics? Over 40% of transgender people attempt suicide sometime in their life, and over 80% seriously consider it. Before we jump to conclusions, or jump off a bridge, let's look at this objectively. The attempted suicide rate for bipolar people is between 20 and 60%, falling right about where transgender people are. Other known mental illnesses have similar rates. And further, it has been noted that the transgender attempted suicide rate is pretty much the same regardless of location. For example, a transgender in rural Mississippi is about as likely to kill themselves as a transgender in downtown Seattle, despite one region having a drastically different level of acceptance for transgenders than the other. The same trend goes for trans-accepting European countries. So instead of saying that the critics are to blame, can we not acknowledge that transgenderism is a tumultuous, self-hating mental illness, and finally give these people the treatment they need?
Objection 4. All the experts agree with us. Oh boy, this should be fun. If your faith in medical experts hasn't been obliterated in the last few years, then there might not be much hope for you. This argument is a classic appeal to authority fallacy. Even if we overlook that, we must remember that all these medical establishments considered gender dysphoria to be a mental disorder until quite recently, and they are run or funded by the federal government. You can see the political bias that will happen under the system. If you don't affirm transgender ideology, then you will be replaced with someone who will. 9 out of 10 scientists agree with the people that fund them.
What is the root cause of transgender ideology taking hold in America? This can be answered in many ways, but I will try to convince you that it all goes back to one thing: the desacramentalization of marriage that took place with the Protestant Revolution. Now hear me out. It might sound outlandish, but I will trace the connection step by step. The Catholic view of marriage, which used to be the entire West view of marriage, is that marriage is a sacrament which cannot be dissolved except through death. Its chief purpose is to create and raise children, and as a result, the marital act must always be open to life. The Protestants, starting with Martin Luther and King Henry VIII, argued that divorce was permissible and that unions weren't sacrosanct. This started the process of undermining marriage and sex. The next big milestone was the allowance of contraception by Christian churches, which started with the Lambeth Conference in 1930. This conference of Anglican clergy allowed contraception between married couples in extreme circumstances. But very quickly this evolved into unrestricted usage between married couples, and all Christian denominations but one allowed it eventually. This was around the same time that Margaret Sanger formed Planned Parenthood and loudly advocated for contraception and abortion as means of empowering women. Contraception broke the link between sex and pregnancy, thus allowing sex to become primarily a recreational act with pleasure as its main purpose. Women got the vote in 1920, at a time when feminism was gaining in popularity. The apex of so-called women's liberation came in 1960 when the pill was invented. This further separated sex from children, thus allowing men and women to forego sexual restraint with wild abandon. It was only a matter of time before abortion had to become legal in 1973, in order to continue the sexual revolution and its consequences. With sex being just an act of pure fun, it was inevitable that homosexuality was the next step. After all, if sex only had to be between consenting adults to be moral, why was it wrong for two men to go at it? I recall a certain Eminem line on that one. In the mainstream logical paradigm, there was no avoiding it. State sodomy laws were repealed, culminating in the nationwide ban on sodomy laws in 2003. But that wasn't enough. If gay people loved each other, why were we stopping them from having the same level of legitimacy as married straight couples? In 2015, after a long national debate, the Supreme Court affirmed that sentiment and legalized gay marriage nationwide. So now we've completely redefined a central institution of nearly every society throughout history, removed the procreative aspect of sex, and pushed for complete equality between the sexes. The natural next step is to redefine sex entirely, and that's where we are today. We have adopted a transhumanist approach where we can change anything about nature, and nothing can stand in the way of our freedom and choice. And now conservatives, who have acquiesced to nearly every step in the process before transgenderism, are baffled that transgenderism is taking off like it is. But I digress.
Finally, why should we care? Who cares, really? Why not just let people enjoy things, right? What's it harming you? To start out with, it is simply false. This ideology is false, and it's a good reason to care about something. But it is more than a small disagreement. It is literally a difference between how we view the very essence of reality itself. Transgender advocates disagree on basic definitions, without which we cannot function properly as individuals or as a society. They cannot answer the question, what is a woman? They are either delusional or ignorant, and we cannot ignore them. Even if we wanted to ignore them, they wouldn't let us just live our lives in peace. Never mind that cisgendered heterosexual Christians have proven themselves to be the most tolerant group in all of history. That's still not enough. They are militant and cannot accept that people don't agree with their insanity. They are coming for you. They are coming for your children. They are coming for every institution you hold dear, and they won't rest until there is 100% compliance.
And today, my doctor, after my EKG results, said that she's feeling confident enough to start me on this medication. So within 2 weeks, I should be lactating. I should be lactating.
Are you content to allow them to indoctrinate and exploit your children? And the contagion effect is real. What started as a tiny portion of a single percentage point has become a sizable contingent within Gen Z. This trend is part of a long downward trajectory of Western society and will only serve to hasten our fall until some foreign power puts us out of our misery.
So when I put my wig on my dress, like, I'm ready to go save the world.
So that we don't leave on a negative note, what should we do about all of this?
Step 1 is to outlaw child mutilation, also known as gender reassignment surgery on minors. This is the bare minimum action that even many libertarians can get on board with. Minors, by legal definition, cannot consent to such a drastic surgery. Additionally, minors should be forbidden from taking so-called gender-affirming hormone therapy. Puberty is not something that should be disrupted. It is a natural part of growing up, and to disrupt it is to set children up for immense physical, mental, and emotional trauma as they enter adulthood.
Step 2 is to protect children from groomers, especially in public schools. Children are impressionable, and they should not be indoctrinated into believing this illogical ideology, nor should they be encouraged to question their gender. Conservatives should follow the lead of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and not shy away from using the state to keep this perversion away from children. Isn't the protection of innocent lives the most fundamental function of government anyway? Such protections should include, but are not limited to, censoring the often sexually explicit and ideologically driven content in school libraries, and keeping teachers from discussing transgenderism and sexual orientation before middle school.
Step 3 is to protect women's sports and force people to compete in sports with their biological sex. Whether you agree with Title IX or not, the fact remains that women and men should each have their own space to compete, to some degree or another. All it takes is 5 minutes, seriously just 5 minutes, of research into world records for various athletic competitions to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that men are physically capable of dominating women in every sport, period. Men shouldn't have to go easy on women to help them win, and women shouldn't have to lose every time while the men rack up effortless victories. This is the same logic behind ranks and divisions in sports. It's not fair to force your child's high school basketball team to play against Golden State. It's no fun for either group. If you want the players to enjoy their sports, they have to be able to compete against those who are similarly competent. And they also have to be able to clean up and unwind in the locker room after a tough game without some imposter making them uncomfortable.
Step 4 is to aggressively defund gender studies departments in public universities and stop funding of LGBTQ+ related research. This is where a lot of the trans propaganda comes from. We could also expand this to include diversity and equity departments in all levels of government. These departments only serve to promote propaganda and divide people. And with all the other pre-existing legal protections for minorities in this country, there is no legitimate reason for these departments to exist.
Step 5 is to outlaw gender reassignment surgery and transgender hormone replacement therapy for all Americans, adults included. Doctors should not humor or enable the mentally ill, and they certainly won't do them any good by permanently mutilating them, nor should doctors block puberty without an extremely good medical reason.
Step 6 is to do what we can to promote the so-called trad economy while continuing to boycott woke brands. It's working, and if it keeps working, the success may inspire others to double down on the culture war and really hit these companies in the wallet where it hurts them the most. Bankrupt enough multi-million-dollar corporations and the others will back down. We outnumber them. Never forget that.
In conclusion, what can we say about transgenderism? It is a final step in the project which we call the sexual revolution. It is a rejection of God, nature, reason, traditional morality, and the family. It is utterly ridiculous. But to anyone out there who experiences gender dysphoria, please know that you don't have to suffer alone. I would suggest you get off of social media and YouTube for at least a month. Disconnect. Read good fiction. Have real interactions with people. Do other wholesome and non-electronic things. Find a priest to help you sort through all this. And if you're in the sorry state of being a detransitioner, just know that we feel for you. You will be rejected by the LGBTQ+ community for being a traitor, and you may be rejected by conservative circles for looking the way you do. Stay strong. There is a growing community of people like you who will help you along the way.
It's time to stop the bloodshed and the pain and lead these people toward real solutions, not pharmaceutical band-aids, make-believe ideology, or promotion of mental illness.